Hello and welcome to a new episode of the IdeaCast. My name is Thomas Wittig, and our topic today will be why your projects run over schedule and exceed budgets and how to fix it. What we are talking about today applies to different areas, for example, product development, marketing, and change projects. We will discover some common problems, their root causes, and discuss some fixes. Most importantly, the center of the topic will be the dynamics of the project management cycle. So the question is, what is driving these dynamics and what is the dynamic behavior that we see in different product settings? This episode is actually a centerpiece for several shorter episodes that will follow about different topics, tactical topics. So the starting point for your project might be a brand new idea or a design or a charter that you have been given by management with a set of requirements. And the idea of every project is to deliver it in a certain time frame. So every project has a start and an end date. And that's the key difference to programs, for example. Though what we're discussing here today, and to some extent also applies to program management. On the other dimension, you probably have to implement the idea under certain constraints, financial constraints or staff that is available. And so that gives you a frame and a target for your time frame, your budget, and your scope. And as long as you are staying within this frame, you are doing okay. Now, the problems start really when you encounter a schedule overrun, for example. It means that you are running over the milestone or over the deadline date, the target date for the product or service that you want to launch, for example. That's a danger zone. The other danger zone is, of course, in the budget area. So when you are exceeding the budget and you have to go back, or worst case, you're completely running out of available budget, then the project is stalled, at least for some period of time, or you have to stop it altogether. Now, when both of these come together, that's when we really have a perfect storm. And this is an area where projects go into a high distress mode. And resulting from that, we can see many dangerous dynamics. So I will give you an example about that later on. The key challenge for these projects is that these dynamics that we encounter, that suddenly a project is facing escalating cost or a continued delay and increasing delays for the launch date, is not only a matter of planning, it is a matter of the inherent feedback structures in projects. And I want to take an example of the Berlin airport. You may or may not have heard about it, but it's a project that has been going on for quite some time. Actually, the first consideration of this project goes back to the last century. And after the reunification of Germany, it was contemplated to have a new airport there. But the project really started in 2006. And at that time, it was believed that the project would take about 2 billion euros to implement. And the time it would take would be until about October 2011. So that was the initial scope and plan for the project. Now, what happened then, as the project moved forward, the first year it looked pretty much okay. So the forecasted cost stayed within the time frame. But already in 2007, it was clear that the cost was going above and beyond. And it was until 2010 and 11, and finally in 11, it was clear that there was no way to complete the airport, and a new exercise had to be completed to come forward with new estimates. And then it turned out that the the project was really escalating in cost. And that's actually a very interesting phenomenon. You can see almost here an exponential growth in cost. And the point is here not that suddenly the plan was to build a larger airport or a more sophisticated one. The project itself was a very complex project, which had, as I mentioned before, some internal challenges that the builder had to deal with. Now, what we heard most recently was that the project will most likely exceed 7 billion euro, and it will not be completed before 2020. So that's actually a prime example of a project that is going into cost escalation, and also the schedule cannot be met and has to be postponed again and again. The interesting thing is that you can find the same or similar patterns in projects in other areas. For example, in IT projects, product development or service development, marketing and marketing campaigns, and also in organizational change and development projects. So let's take a look at the dynamics and the structures that are here in place so that we can figure out what to do. The way I would like to approach this segment of project dynamics is to go through some sample projects or mention some sample projects. And keep in mind that what we are discussing here applies to different areas, such as new product development, digital transformation projects, and productization. By productization we mean that, for example, a large service organization suddenly wants to productize their knowledge and turn it into a software as a service solution. That's a typical scenario. Then good example are software as a service development projects and go-to-market. Now, this is a very peculiar combination, because here we see that the project dynamics meet the market dynamics, and that creates a whole new set of developments. And we will come back to that later once we have explored the basic core principles around project dynamics. Then digital marketing campaigns. Also, you may want to watch some of the other videos I have provided about this topic, digital marketing, especially when it comes to estimating the cost and dealing with uncertainty. But also other areas like not really a construction project, but for example, if you're planning a new service delivery center for customer success teams, for example, or you're moving from one to another, or you're migrating your customer base to a new software platform, that's typically also a project which has a clear start and end date, fairly clear scope, and also a certain requirement and quality expectation. And last but not least, organizational change project. This is not only about people and let's say communications and org charts, but a good organizational change project, or a more effective one, is characterized by let's say a fairly swift implementation, because projects that drag on for too long can have a very severe impact on employee morale and productivity, of course. So that's one area where project management is really important. Now, what are the cornerstones of project management? Let's revisit some of the basics, but again, I can promise you that we will not go through the basic steps of project planning or how to put a plan together. But the interesting fact here, which relates to our topic, is of course a project has a certain scope. And by that we mean, of course, that it has a certain set of requirements that will take a number of person days to complete. Secondly, the budget can be articulated in financial terms, but also in person days, for example. And then finally, we want to also generate some quality or quality outcome, which means that we expect that the work that is being done is done at at a fairly high quality that meets our expectation or the client's expectation at the end. And of course, the schedule. Schedule means that we have not only the scheduling of people in the project, but that we have a start and finish date or expected finish dates and certain milestones. And the combination of these four elements that keeps us busy, of course, as project managers. Now, one thing to understand is that a project is a complex system surrounded by uncertainty and volatility. Project as a system means that there are, let's say, elements in the system which create let's say feedback structures, for example. So we have things that accumulate over time. For example, the amount of work that is completed, you could consider as a stock of work that is completed. Other areas are, for example, staff. When you hire staff, you have a certain capacity, so that accumulates or depletes over time as you are hiring or laying off people or reducing people from the project. And by uncertainty, we mean that there are things we don't know, for example. So, for example, the productivity could be fluctuating over time. Volatility could be driven by unforeseen things and changes, for example, in share prices or foreign exchange rates or wage rates, etc. So these are the things that we have to keep in mind. In other words, a project is not a piece of paper and a plan that we have to follow, but we have to deal with fairly complex changes over time. Now, talking a little bit more about the dynamics of the projects, here's how I envision that we go through each one of these topics in the next episode. So first, for each topic, I will discuss what is the actual challenge that project managers typically encounter, then what is causing it, what are the dynamic consequences and the impact on the business, the project plan, people, stakeholder, etc. And then we will discuss the responses. So how to prevent, improve, and optimize the situation. And some of the tactics and strategies can be used within flight of a project, and some of them apply only to the next project, unfortunately. So there are certain things that you can't redo. For example, when you're starting out on the wrong foot and you haven't factored in certain elements in your staffing plan, then it's pretty much too late when you are, let's say, in the middle of your project. And last but not least, I will share the tools and concepts and make also these tools available in the briefing center for you to download and to use. So what does it mean? I'm taking just one generic example for now. So let's say we have a project which is facing a schedule overrun, and we are interested in the question, okay, what is causing this and where is this going actually? So where is this project going to finish, and at what level of cost also. Then what are the dynamic consequences? Well, in this case, we were interested in figuring out the root cause, and we almost have to ask backwards. So the nonlinear increase in expected finish time came from a higher effort than planned, and that came from a lot more rework that had to be done, and that came because there was not a plan for how to deal with rework and an error fraction. So there was no assumption about what the error fraction would be. I'm coming back to that in a couple of slides today. Now, the question is, what can you do about it? Of course, you have to build in reasonable assumptions for rework. That's something that you can also change within a project and see how you can turn the project around with appropriate staffing. Now, oftentimes what happens in projects, if something happens, then people tend to throw more resources at a project. And that could make a distressed project already worse. So that's not always the best solution. Okay. So when we have a situation like this, then what I envision we do is that we take a look at the feedback structure and see how that relates and how this is driving the project. and the project dynamics. And from there, we're also interested in how can we optimize this. So what are the tools and concepts that we have at our disposal to turn the project situation around? What causes projects to miss or completely fail? Some of the key challenges that we see are the following. And there's actually a related video for that. It's called The Life of a Project. And there I'm explaining the life cycle of a project in a more somewhat entertaining way, I would say. But there you can see how some of these challenges come to the surface. So what you often see is that people don't communicate with each other, which leads to different assumptions. Then you have problems with the feasibility of the plan. That typically happens when you have a misbalance between the resources that you have planned for and that you have available and what it really takes to deliver a project. Then there are uncertainties in terms of, for example, uncertainties of task duration, staff availability, but also rework. And I'd like to come back to the topic of rework because this is a central topic in project dynamics. Now, each of these challenges has an individual effect that can be traced back. But some of them have a compounding snowball effect. So, for example, if you forget to factor in the error fraction in your calculation, then you will see that a high error fraction in your project, which could be driven by different factors, can have a compounding effect, a snowball effect. So it creates a disproportionate higher amount of effort in the project. That's just the way it is. It's embedded in pretty much every system project structure that you will see. And some of these effects, when you combine them together, they're not only creating dynamics, but they're almost like dynamite. So, for example, if you have a high error fraction, which leads to a lot of rework, and you have an unfeasible plan and scope changes on top of it, you can be pretty sure that it has an adverse impact on your staffing, staff morale, then on productivity, and then it drives a vicious cycle in your product. So that's always something to keep in mind. Now, uncertainty is everywhere and around us. So about projects and VUCA. VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It's a concept that has been, or the phrase has been coined many years ago. And it also especially applies to project management and campaign management. Now, when projects are conducted under complexity and uncertainty, which is pretty much the case in every project these days, then it requires more insight in the dynamic behavior and what is actually really happening in the project. And it requires also a systemic perspective. So which means we need to understand the project and the organization and the environment around it as a system where the actors interact and play with each other in a certain way. So something to keep in mind. And based on that, we can build more resilient capabilities for our teams and organization to deal with these situations. Now, you may want to ask, okay, why planning? Because it might be an experienced project manager or a very mature organization. And it's really a matter of the question, what is at stake and how big is your appetite for risk? So here are top 10 questions that you could consider in determining the degree of planning that you should conduct for your project. So, for example, if you have to meet a deadline or if you have budget constraints, and on top of that, if you have to meet a deadline because after that you will face penalties or let's say human beings are at risk if you don't deliver, then you better have a very sound planning, tracking, and project control in place. That's very important. Now, if you have a low impact, low risk project, I would say don't really worry about these topics, but the more you go in the high risk, high impact quadrant, the more important it is to do the planning. Now, what does it mean? Here are some elements for, let's say, the plans and planning. Now, I distinguish here between low, medium, and high risk situations. Now, in a low risk situation, you don't have to do all of these things, but it's still good to have a clear project charter and know who's on the team and what the expectations are in terms of scope, budget, and roles and responsibilities, and to do a proper kickoff, of course, because if a project isn't really kicked off and doesn't have a start and a finish, then it's very difficult for the contributors to orient themselves and contribute. On the other side of the spectrum, when you really talk about high impact, high risk projects or high risk exposure, you may want to go through a very thorough process, which includes all of these areas and a lot of, I would also say, statistical modeling. So you really understand what is driving the performance of the project and what's driving the progress. And how can you make sure that you are not facing these escalations in terms of cost and schedule risk. Now, the rule of thumb, of course, is the more is at stake, the better the planning needs to be. And it's always important to have, for every project, a clear meeting and review cadence, which keeps the team aligned and cohesive, so that you can move the agenda forward. So I would say that's a basic must. Okay, today I want to cover only a couple of examples, so to get us going here. In the next episodes, I will dive a little bit more deeply into these topics. So the first topic I want to touch and give you a first flavor of it is the question about rework and errors. And that's a fairly common mistake in project planning, that people don't consider the rework driven by a certain error fraction in the work that's being done. Now, the dynamic structure that is behind it, and this is a very simplified illustration, is like this. So, for example, you have an amount of work that needs to be done, which means you have added some scope to the project, and you know you need to have a set of requirements, and it takes a certain amount of person days to complete. So that's what we call the work to be done. And then once you do the work correctly, it would then be work completed. And after you have assembled a lot of, let's say, modules for your product or your infrastructure, you can actually release the product and go to market with your product, your SaaS solution, your campaign, whatever it is. Okay, now this would be the ideal case, but of course it's human nature that some of the work will contain errors. So that's work that we will discover over time as rework. And typically what happens between actually the error and the rework discovery is that there is a delay, which makes things a little bit more interesting for us, or more challenging, I should say. And so once the rework is discovered, it enters the cycle again. So that's a feedback loop, a feedback structure within a project. And I take this as a simple illustration. In reality, it's a little bit more complex, but the fundamental archetype applies to a lot of project situations. Now, the question is, how does it articulate itself? And so what you see in the setting here, for example, so this comes from a simulation about a project progress and performance scenario. And actually what happens here, if you start here on the right-hand side, so the project starts in the month 5, and was supposed to finish, I believe, in month 12 or something like that. But as soon as the project started, through certain compounding effects, the error rate also increased from 5% to almost 20% or 18% here, and then decreased over time. So that means that we have an additional amount of rework in person days that is coming into our backlog of work that needs to be done. And that leads to somewhat of a nonlinear effect in our progress here. So here we have the time and the person days, and let's say the project has a total scope of about 1,000 person days. So, and note that there's not a linear line. So you're not starting in month 5 and then there's a linear progress. So it starts out a little bit slower, then the progress accelerates. And then as people begin rolling off the project and finishing the last work that needs to be done, the progress is actually flattening out. And then finally the project completes not in month 12, but in month probably 22 or something like that. Now, what that means actually is the following. So this was our original plan, which meant we had 1,000 person days worth of scope to deliver, and we were planning to do that in month 14 after a certain duration. But actually what happened is that we exceeded schedule and budget quite dramatically. So this is a very common situation, and you find that in many projects. The second challenge I want to touch today is about design and scope changes. Fairly common. So you're doing a project, you're running a project, and then in the middle of the project, the client says, oh yeah, by the way, we really liked what you deliver, but could you also do this and that? And of course, the sales people will say, yeah, exactly, what we will do. It will cost you a little bit more, but we can do it. So basically, you are increasing the scope of your project. Now back to our little project model. What that actually means is you are somewhere in the middle of the project, you are increasing the scope through a change. And that could come, for example, from the completed work, so that you discover once the work is assembled and completed that some functionality is missing and that you have to add some new functionality, for example. Or worst case, when the product is released to the market, you could also get feedback from the market that for example, the product is not on par anymore with other peer solutions, with other competitors. So that's a very common case, because as you delay your project, the world is also moving on in the meantime. And when you discover that, you know, what you had originally planned is out of date, you have to go back to the drawing board and update your product. And that means, of course, that you have to re-enter the whole cycle again. Now, interesting, and I'm taking this from another work where we discussed a simulation about project dynamics. And the interesting insight here was that a 10% increase in scope in this situation led to a 23% increase in cost. So that means that, for example, if you have the 1,000 person days that we were supposed to deliver, and you add 10% on top of it, you're not ending up at let's say 1,100 of person days in this project, but you're ending up at a much higher rate. Now, in this project, the problem was that the original project was already delayed, but then when you add a scope change to this, you are seeing a nonlinear increase and much higher increase in terms of cost and schedule for this project. So this is something to be aware of. Also, timing plays a key role here. The other key factors that are typically in play here are the rework cycle, the error rate, of course, delays, the accumulation of tasks, and the schedule pressure that comes with it. So we will come back to all of these over time in the IdeaCast series. Now, what can happen is that these situations can be aggravated. So it can get worse if you have an organization that is fairly inflexible in hiring. You have certain hard constraints, or it takes too long, and you have long delays between you discovering certain challenges and then reacting to it and making decisions, allocating resources, etc. If you're too late, then that delays also the project, and it contributes to this nonlinear escalation of costs. So Now we're coming very close to the nature of project dynamics, and I wanted to use these two examples to set the stage for the next episodes that are coming. And certainly we have to deal with volatility and uncertainty. It is everywhere. And I will discuss more about that in one of the very next briefings, where I'm going to talk more about project risk analysis in a more quantitative way that is including uncertainty. So stay tuned for that. You may want to check back on the channel or in the briefing center. Now the tools that you can use for this, you will again find everything in the briefing center. So I'm uploading some of the templates that I'm showcasing through the series. There will be checklists in the briefing center. There's also some group coaching. So for people who have questions or want to discuss particular challenges or insights, that's the place to go. And also sometimes I'm publishing dynamic simulations that are easy to work with. So I'm not expecting you to be, let's say, a system dynamicist or developer who can put these models together. So I'm making it more user-friendly so that you can just explore and gain some experiential learning insights from working with these simulations. Now, in conclusion for today, here's a quick recap of the takeaways. So first, I would suggest to adjust your project management approach according to the level of impact and risk. Secondly, it's really important to understand the dynamics and the uncertainties which are embedded in the feedback structure of your project. Number three, be prepared for creating more robust capabilities, for being ready, and also have a very responsive and agile organization and delivery mechanism, because that's a new requirement, and we see that more and more coming in digital transformation projects, for example, or in all kinds of other projects. And just make sure that you're not having a mindset that everything is cast in stone. I would more promote a mindset of discovery-driven planning, where you actually go forward and review from milestone to milestone, and you adjust your approach and your insights and also your project performance modeling as you go forward. So I've given you some first indication here, and there will be more examples coming forward. Now, this topic and a whole set of other topics in a kind of a 360 degree around transformation, innovation, and growth can be found at the Academy website. And it would be great if you could share with your team if you find this useful. You can point the people to the YouTube channel. So search for Wittigonia, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment, and stay connected. And I hope to see you soon in one of the next live briefings and in the Academy. So check it out. It's actually really worthwhile engaging on these topics. So good luck with your projects, and I'm looking forward to having you in one of the next segments. Bye-bye.